3 hours after Pope Leo XIV finished speaking, the Vatican's official website collapsed. It was not a cyber attack. It was not a system failure. It was 47 million attempted visits in under 90 minutes. A digital stampede of Catholics trying to read the words Rome had just heard. Inside the Apostolic Palace, the phones would not stop ringing. But the real signal was not the noise. It was the silence moving through the Curia, through the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, through the Secretariat of State, through offices where aides stared at screens and no one wanted to speak first. Cardinal Pietro Parolin sat alone behind a closed door, knowing he had tried to stop the warning before it reached the world. What Pope Leo revealed on the morning of June 10, 2026, was never supposed to be said in public. Not with the leaked document already spreading across the media, not with senior officials trying to soften the truth before the faithful could hear it, and certainly not with the entire Church watching a pope choose exposure over protection. To understand why the Vatican froze after the address, the story has to move back 72 hours. On June 7, 2026, Pope Leo XIV sat in a private room on the third floor of the Apostolic Palace with a 43-page report in front of him. Robert Francis Prevost, the 71-year-old former Bishop of Chiclayo and the first American to sit on the throne of Peter, was not reading a public briefing. He was reading the internal anatomy of a scandal. The report had been compiled by a special commission he had quietly assembled in February, shortly after the publication of his first encyclical, Magnifica Humanitas. Its official name sounded harmless, the Pontifical Working Group on Institutional Transparency. But inside the Vatican, officials called it the Prevost Commission. They feared it because its mandate was simple enough to be dangerous. Follow the money. Every diocese, every fund, every transfer, over 100,000 euros that had moved through Vatican-affiliated accounts during the previous 10 years. Leo had authorized the investigation himself, bypassing the usual channels and going directly to the Prefecture for the Economy for full access. Resistance came quickly, as it always does when a system hears the key turning in the lock. Leo did not negotiate with the hesitation. He gave one instruction: open the books, or he would open them himself. By the evening of June 7th, the books were open, and what they revealed was no longer an accounting problem. It was a moral crisis with numbers attached. The first numbers in the report were staggering enough to stop any room from pretending this was routine. More than 800 million euros had been diverted, misallocated, or could not be accounted for across Vatican-linked channels. The money had not disappeared through one dramatic theft. It had moved through foundations, charitable accounts, investment vehicles, legal expenses, and administrative shadows that made every transfer look explainable until the pattern became impossible to ignore. Charitable donations meant for disaster relief in sub-Saharan Africa had ended up connected to real estate investments in London. Peter's pence contributions, the faithful's direct offering to the Pope, had been funneled into speculative financial instruments that lost tens of millions. Seminary funds had been redirected to cover legal settlements that were never publicly disclosed. Behind the numbers stood a network of intermediaries, shell companies, and officials who had operated for years with almost total impunity. One section of the report was worse than the rest because it did not hide behind institutional language. A Vatican-linked foundation had collected more than 60 million euros in donations for schools and hospitals in South America. The donors had been thanked. The projects had been announced, and the promises had been made in the language of mercy. But the schools were never built, and the hospitals never opened. The money had been redirected into a fund managed through a Luxembourg-based holding company. Over 4 years, that fund used it to purchase luxury apartments in Milan and Geneva. The foundation's directors received consulting fees totaling nearly 3 million euros. Not one child in South America benefited from a single cent. That detail broke something inside Robert Francis Prevost. Not the abstract total, not the financial instruments, Children had been promised classrooms, families had been promised clinics, and the promise had carried the name of the church. Leo set the report down, removed his glasses, and pressed his fingers against the bridge of his nose, the old habit of a mathematics student facing a problem that no calculation alone could solve. At 9:47 that night, Pope Leo picked up the phone and called Archbishop Edgar Peña Parra. Peña Parra was the sostituto for general affairs, the Vatican official responsible for the daily machinery of internal governance. In practical terms, he functioned as the Church's chief operating officer, the man who knew which offices moved, which files stalled, and which corridors became dangerous when a pope asked the wrong question. When the call came that late, he understood it was not about routine business. Leo did not open with explanation. He told Peña Parra that he wanted to address the report publicly before the end of the week. The words were calm, but the decision behind them was already formed. A public address meant the scandal would not remain inside Vatican offices, not inside restricted memos, not inside meetings where language could be softened until no one was responsible. There was a pause on the line. Peña Parra chose his words carefully, because advising a pope is not the same as resisting him. But in the Vatican, the distance between those two acts can collapse quickly. He said the timing might not be ideal. Leo had just returned from Spain, the media was still processing Barcelona, and perhaps a more private path would allow the Church to prepare. Leo cut through the caution. He said Peña Parra's name once, quietly, and told him he had not asked for an opinion on timing. He had asked him to prepare the address. The instruction moved through the line like a sealed order, and Peña Parra knew there would be no appeal to schedule, optics, or institutional comfort. That call set the next 48 hours in motion. What began as a financial report became a confrontation between the Church and its own instinct for self-protection. It would not be a battle with the outside world. Not at first. It would be Rome against Rome, fought through drafts, leaks, closed doors, and one pope who had decided that silence had become complicity. By the morning of June 8th, the news had already moved through the upper levels of the Curia. The pope was preparing a major public statement, not a homily, not an encyclical, not a controlled letter sent quietly to bishops' conferences. It would be a direct address to the faithful, and the subject would be financial corruption inside the Church itself. The reaction was immediate because everyone understood the danger of a pope speaking before the system had time to manage him. At 7:15 that morning, Cardinal Pietro Parolin convened an emergency meeting in his office at the Secretariat of State. Present were Archbishop Paul Gallagher, the Secretary for Relations with States, Cardinal Fernando Vergés Alzaga, the President of the Governorate of Vatican City State, and Monsignor Luis Marin de San Martin, an Augustinian like Leo and a member of the commission that had produced the report. The door was closed. The tone was controlled. The pressure was not. Parolin said the Pope could not go public with the full report. If he did, donations could collapse, lawsuits could multiply, governments could open investigations, and the Church could become the headline of every newspaper in the world for reasons no diplomat could contain. His voice stayed measured, but his hands gripped the edge of the desk. That small failure of control said more than the argument itself. Gallagher moved to the diplomatic consequences. The Holy See had concordats with 37 nations and financial transparency obligations with European institutions and Moneyval. If governments learned that Vatican officials had known about irregularities and failed to act, the fallout could move beyond embarrassment into asset freezes, legal claims, and simultaneous investigations across jurisdictions. The scandal would no longer belong to Rome alone. Monsignor Marin interrupted. The commission was the action, he said, because Leo had created it precisely to expose and address what had been hidden. Vergés Alzaga answered sharply that the commission was supposed to remain internal, not become a press conference. Marin looked back at him and said with restraint that the Holy Father decided what it was intended to be. The room went quiet because everyone knew he was right. The Pope could speak when he chose, where he chose, and on the subject he chose. The question was not whether he had the authority. The question was whether anyone in that room could still persuade him not to use it. Parolin tried a softer path. He proposed a middle ground, a written letter, a controlled setting, a private communication to bishops' conferences, something that acknowledged concerns while giving the Vatican time. Marine asked time for what? For the evidence to be buried, the accounts to be restructured, the responsible men to retire quietly. Parolin said it would give the Church time to manage the narrative, then heard his own words land in the room like a confession. Gallagher raised the practical danger again. A public address could invite governments to freeze Vatican assets, open their own investigations, and bring financial proceedings in several countries at once. Marine answered quietly that perhaps those jurisdictions would find what the Church should have found years earlier. Parolin stared at him, and in that moment the meeting stopped being advisory. It became defensive. Parolin made his decision after the room had exhausted every argument that sounded responsible from the outside. He did not frame it as opposition to the Pope. He would later describe it as an act taken in his capacity as Secretary of State, designed to protect the Church from uncontrolled damage. Inside that office on June 8th, it meant something simpler. If Leo would not soften the message, the Secretariat of State would create something soft enough to stand beside it. He authorized the drafting of an alternative document. It would acknowledge areas of concern in financial management, promise continued review, cite reform, and use the language of stewardship, responsibility, and prudence. It would contain all the correct institutional vocabulary. It would say almost nothing that could wound anyone powerful. The team worked overnight. 3 curial officials drafted 14 pages with the precision of men trained to make danger sound procedural. The document cited canon law, referred to financial reforms already implemented under Pope Francis, and presented the Vatican as a system already correcting itself. Its purpose was not to deny the coming scandal. Its purpose was to absorb it before Leo could name it. By the morning of June 9th, the document had a formal title, Considerations on Financial Stewardship in the Service of the Church's Mission. Copies went to selected members of the Curia and to the Vatican press office. Then came the fatal decision. 2 journalists at Il Messaggero, both with long-standing relationships inside the Secretariat of State, received copies as well. At 2:30 that afternoon, the document appeared online. In ordinary Vatican life, leaks were nothing new. But this was different because the leak did not reveal only information. It revealed strategy. It showed the world that someone inside the Vatican was trying to preempt the Pope's own warning. The leaked text was deliberately bland, and that was precisely why it became explosive. It softened what had not yet been spoken. It created the impression that the Vatican was already handling what Leo was preparing to expose. The story shifted in minutes from financial corruption to a direct struggle between the Pope and the highest machinery of the Curia. But outside the Apostolic Palace, no one knew the most important fact. Leo had expected the document to leak. He had watched the Vatican long enough to know that power rarely attacks truth directly when it can surround it with context first. By the evening of June 9th, while commentators debated whether he would retreat, the Pope was already preparing the answer that would make retreat impossible. On the evening of June 9th, the leaked document was spreading faster than anyone inside the Secretariat of State could control. Vatican correspondents were filing stories about internal division. Cable news anchors were asking whether the new Pope had already lost control of his own Curia. Commentators treated the 14-page document as a signal that Leo might be forced into a narrower, safer version of the truth. Inside the papal apartments, Robert Francis Prevost was doing the opposite. He sat at his desk and rewrote the address by hand. He was not editing the first draft. He was replacing it with something harder, sharper, and more direct, line by line, while the 43-page report remained open beside him like evidence that refused to be buried. No advisors were in the room. No speechwriters shaped the tone. No diplomat softened the verbs. There was only the Pope, a pen, and the record of money diverted from the people who had trusted the church most. At one point, Father Marco Delgado, a young Augustinian priest who had served with Prevost in Peru, knocked on the door and brought him tea. Leo thanked him, then asked whether he remembered Sister Catalina in Chulucanas. Delgado nodded. He knew the name, and he knew from the Pope's voice that the question was not casual. Sister Catalina had run a small clinic for children in the rural highlands. Years earlier, she had asked Prevost for help because she needed medicine, simple medicine, antibiotics, antiparasiticals, basic supplies that cost almost nothing in Rome, but meant survival in a remote village. Prevost had written to Rome, filled out the forms, and followed every procedure. The money never came. The clinic closed 6 months later. Leo looked down at the report on his desk and said he now knew where the money had gone. Delgado left the room quietly because he understood that what remained behind the closed door was not a communications problem. It was grief turning into action. At approximately 11:30 that night, Pope Leo set down his pen. According to a source close to the papal household, he spoke aloud, though no one was meant to answer. They wanted him quiet, and that was exactly why he had to speak. By then, the leaked document had not weakened the address. It had sharpened it. The morning of June 10th arrived under a Roman summer heat that made the city feel ancient and tense before the first official word had been spoken. Around St. Peter's Square, people began gathering earlier than usual, and they did not move like tourists. Romans came from nearby parishes. Clergy arrived from churches across the city. Students from the pontifical universities stood in small groups, reading updates on their phones and looking toward the Vatican as if the walls themselves might answer. By 6 o'clock, the piazza near the Paul VI audience hall was already filling. The Vatican press office had confirmed that Pope Leo would speak at 10, but it had given no details. That absence of detail became its own announcement. The faithful understood that Rome was holding something back, and that made them come faster. Inside the Apostolic Palace, the final hours before the address were disorder, disguised as procedure. At 7 o'clock, Cardinal Parolin made one last attempt. He went directly to the papal apartments and was stopped by the Swiss guard, who told him the Pope was at morning prayer and could not be disturbed. Parolin waited in the corridor for 40 minutes. When Leo emerged, Parolin stepped forward and said he needed to speak with him. The Pope did not send him away. He told him to walk. They moved together through the Sala Regia, past Renaissance frescoes and stone surfaces that had seen centuries of men trying to preserve power by slowing truth down. Parolin began with the circulated document. Leo interrupted him with precision, calling it his document. There was no accusation in the tone, only accuracy. Parolin tried to explain that it had been meant to provide context and balance, so the faithful would not receive the report without institutional framing. Leo stopped walking. He faced the Secretary of State and spoke not as a strategist, but as the former missionary who had carried Rome's promises into poor homes in Peru. He had sat with families in Chulucanas and Chiclayo who gave their last coins to the church because they trusted those coins would serve God's purpose. He would not balance their trust against Vatican comfort. Parolin opened his mouth, then closed it. Leo told him he could attend the address or choose not to, but the address would happen and it would contain the truth. Then he turned and continued walking. The final appeal had failed before the cameras were even switched on. At 8:30, another attempt came through the offices of the Dicastery for Communication. Paolo Ruffini, the prefect and a veteran journalist before his Vatican appointment, received a call from an unnamed source inside the Secretariat of State. The source said the Pope's address should be delayed because of procedural concerns and improper channels. Ruffini asked one question: whether the order came from the Pope. The source admitted it did not. It was, he said, in the Pope's best interest. Ruffini hung up, walked to the audience hall, and personally confirmed with the technical team that the live broadcast would proceed as scheduled. Cameras, microphones, streaming platforms, all of it would remain live. At 9:15, Cardinal Kevin Farrell arrived at the Paul VI audience hall. He had spoken with Leo the night before and knew the address had become harder after the leak. Near the entrance, he told a group of bishops that whatever they thought they knew about the day, they did not. They should listen carefully and pray. At 9:45, the hall was full. 7,000 people filled the seats. Cardinals, bishops, priests, religious sisters, ambassadors, journalists, and ordinary faithful who had followed the rumors into the room. The silence was not peaceful. It was charged, disciplined, and waiting for the moment when a pope would decide how much truth the church could bear. At 9:58, Pope Leo XIV entered the Paul VI audience hall through the side door. He wore simple white vestments, no additional regalia, no papal stole, nothing that made the moment look ceremonial. The simplicity was deliberate because this was not a liturgy, not a celebration, and not a performance of papal warmth. It was a reckoning placed before 7,000 witnesses. He walked to the microphone and did not smile. He did not greet the crowd with the familiar softness that usually opened papal gatherings. He looked across the hall at cardinals, bishops, priests, sisters, diplomats, journalists, and ordinary faithful. Then he waited until the silence became impossible to misunderstand. When he spoke, he said he had not come to offer comfort or reassurance. He had come because the truth demanded a voice, and he would be that voice. A murmur moved through the hall, and in the press section, reporters began typing before the second sentence had finished. The Pope had opened the address by removing every escape route. He rejected the argument that difficult truths required careful timing, strategic handling, or diplomatic protection. The Church did not belong to diplomats, he said. It belonged to Christ. Christ did not come to manage perceptions. He came to set people free. Then Leo reached beneath the lectern and lifted the 43-page report. He told the hall that the commission had been created in February to examine the financial operations of the institution because the faithful deserved to know how their sacrifices had been honored. They deserved transparency, accountability, and truth. He held the report high enough for the cameras to see it. This report, he said, was the truth. For the next 45 minutes, Leo dismantled the financial facade with methodical precision. He named specific funds, specific amounts, and specific transactions. He described charitable money moved into private investment vehicles, humanitarian funds diverted to cover operational deficits, and contributions from the faithful used to finance legal defenses for officials accused of misconduct. His voice stayed controlled, which made the facts harder to escape. Then he reached the South American Foundation. He described the promised schools, the hospitals that never opened, and the more than 60 million euros redirected into luxury real estate through a Luxembourg-based structure. He read the names of the projects. He read the names of the towns in Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador, places where people had prayed, waited, and received nothing. Several people in the hall began to weep. Leo did not name individuals at that moment, but he announced that the full report would be sent to the Vatican's Office of the Auditor General, to the Financial Intelligence Authority, to external auditing firms, and to the relevant civil authorities in jurisdictions where potential financial crimes had been identified. Audible gasps moved across the hall. The Vatican had just heard a pope invite the outside world into its locked rooms. Then his voice dropped, almost to a whisper. He said there were people inside the institution who believed they were untouchable, who believed Vatican walls could protect them from accountability, and who believed sacred office could become a shield for personal enrichment. He looked directly into the main camera and told them those walls no longer protected them. They would answer not only to him or the Curia, but to God, and if necessary, to the law. The hall did not erupt after that line. It inhaled. 1,000 small movements passed through the room at once, bishops shifting in their seats, journalists lowering their eyes to their screens, sisters pressing rosaries into their palms, officials from the Curia staring forward as if stillness could protect them. Pope Leo let the silence hold because the warning was not finished. He said he knew the address would cause pain, confusion, and anger. He knew some would accuse him of betraying the Church by speaking these things aloud. Then he answered them directly. The Church was not betrayed by truth. The Church was betrayed by silence. His hands tightened on the edges of the lectern. He spoke of Peru, not as a memory used for tenderness, but as evidence. He had lived among people who had nothing except faith and trust in the Church, and he had made a promise in his heart that if he ever had the power to honor that trust, he would. He would not break that promise for politics, comfort, or anyone. In the front row, Cardinal Parolin sat motionless. His face gave away nothing, but those close enough to see his hands later said they were trembling. Then Leo turned toward the leaked document. He said a paper had been circulated the day before, a document he had not authorized, designed to soften what he was saying, to make truth smoother, safer, and easier to swallow. The press section exploded into typing. Every correspondent understood that the hidden struggle had just become public. Leo said he was aware of the efforts, aware that institutions resisted change, and aware that power protected itself. He had not become pope to manage an institution. He had become pope to serve Christ's people, and they deserved more than a sanitized version of the truth. He stepped back, breathed once, then returned with a quieter voice. He remembered studying mathematics at Villanova and learning that every equation had a solution. Sometimes the solution was beautiful. Sometimes it was painful, but it could not be avoided forever. The Catholic Church, he said, had been delaying its solution for too long. That day, he was ending the delay. The address then widened from institutional exposure into a spiritual challenge, and Leo told the faithful not to lose faith in the Church because of human failure. They should lose faith in the illusion that institutions are perfect. He connected the warning to Barcelona, where he had called Catholics to become witnesses and prophets of unity. Unity was not achieved by hiding wounds. It was achieved by showing where the Church was broken and where it would heal. Then he spoke of Madrid, of more than 600,000 young people in the Plaza de Lima, and said they had not come to see a perfect church. They had come to see a real one. Then came the line that would define the address. Leo looked out over the hall and said he was not asking the Church to be comfortable. He was asking the Church to be Christian. For 3 full seconds after he finished, the Paul VI audience hall remained completely silent, as if the sentence had struck the room before anyone knew how to answer it. Then the applause began. It started slowly, scattered across the hall, uncertain at first, as if no one knew whether applause was the right response to a warning so severe. Then it grew into a wave. 7,000 people rose to their feet, some weeping, some standing in stunned silence, all aware that the Church had crossed a line it could not uncross. Pope Leo stepped back from the lectern. He did not acknowledge the applause, did not smile, and did not return to the microphone. He simply turned toward the side door and walked back into the Apostolic Palace. Behind him, the hall remained standing, with nuns near the back, holding hands in silent prayer, and Cardinal Matteo Zuppi in the 3rd row, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. In the press section, a Reuters reporter turned to her colleague and said she had covered 5 papacies and had never seen anything like it. Her colleague answered that nobody had. Within 1 hour, the Vatican's official website crashed. Within 2 hours, every major news network on the planet was running the story. Within 4 hours, 3 cardinals requested emergency meetings with the Secretariat of State. Within 6 hours, Church of Truth was trending in 47 countries. But the most important reaction came 12 hours later, at 10 o'clock on the night of June 10th, when Cardinal Parolin issued a 1-paragraph statement through the Vatican press office. It said the Holy Father's address reflected his pastoral commitment to transparency and accountability, and that the Secretariat of State would fully support the processes he had outlined. Those who understood Vatican language knew what the statement meant. It was not support. It was surrender. The most powerful man in the Curia after the Pope had bowed to the inevitable because the truth was already public and there was nothing left to manage. Behind closed doors, the panic moved faster. At least 7 senior curial officials spent that evening calling financial advisors, lawyers, and in some cases family members. One official was seen leaving Vatican City at 11 o'clock carrying 2 briefcases. He did not return the next day or the day after. In the days that followed, the machinery Leo had activated began to move outward. The Auditor General's office announced an expanded investigation. 3 senior officials in the administration of the patrimony of the Apostolic See submitted resignations. The Guardia di Finanza opened a preliminary inquiry into several transactions named in the report. Across the world, bishops began receiving letters from the Pontifical Commission demanding full financial disclosures. What had started as a 43-page report in a private Vatican room now reached dioceses far beyond Rome. The warning had become an audit, and the audit had become a global pressure system. The Church had heard the Pope speak, and now every account would have to answer. Amid the institutional shock, one image kept moving through the world. It was a photograph taken by a Vatican photographer moments after Leo left the hall, showing him walking alone through a long corridor inside the Apostolic Palace. The corridor was empty. The light was pale, and his head was slightly bowed. He looked tired, but not uncertain. Later, a journalist asked a member of the papal household what the Pope had done when he returned to his apartments after the address. The aide hesitated before answering. Leo had asked for a glass of water, then sat down and read. When the journalist asked what he was reading, the answer came quietly, "The Gospel of John, chapter 8, verse 32. That verse spoke of truth and freedom, but Leo's warning had not been a sermon. It had not been about doctrine, politics, culture wars, or the controversy of the week. It had been about whether the Catholic Church, the oldest and largest institution in the Western world, could survive its own dishonesty. His answer was clear. It could not, so the dishonesty had to end. Whether the Church would follow through remained uncertain. History had seen reform begin with fire and end in ash. But those who stood inside the Paul VI audience hall on June 10, 2026, remembered the quiet fury in Leo's voice, the report raised in his hand, and 7,000 people rising because they understood something irreversible had begun. The first American Pope, the first Augustinian Pope, the man from Chicago who had spent 2 decades among the poorest people in Peru, had looked at the most powerful institution in Christianity and said enough. And for the first time in a very long time, the institution had no answer.